Chapter 9 is titled as Hearing the Last of It. This chapter is pretty significant because here we get to see another aspect to Mrs. Parseet's character, and from this chapter onwards we shall see how she plays the role of a spy and plotter against Louisa Gradgrind and James Harthouse. Now, after the bank robbery, she took the excuse of her nervousness, and now she dwells at Mr. Bounderbye's country house along with him and Louisa Gradgrind. But as far as her treatment of Louisa Gradgrind is concerned, we find that she is completely reluctant to address her as Mrs. Bounderbye. Rather, she continues to address her as Miss Gradgrind, because according to her it is just out of habit. She has got used to calling her Miss Gradgrind, and that is why she finds it very uncomfortable to address her Mrs. Bounderbye. However, the actual reason, the actual cause is something else. We know that Mrs. Parseet has never accepted Bounderbye's marriage with Louisa, and that is why she is very angry with Bounderbye as well, though she never expresses it before him. Rather, what she does, she always flatters Bounderbye and bestows upon him special acts of attention. Extraordinary, attention is given to him by Mrs. Parseet, and she has an intention behind doing it. She does it only to emphasize Louisa's indifference towards him. She aims to make Bounderbye realize that Louisa has no care, affection, and concern for Bounderbye, and that is why on the second morning of her stay with Bounderbye in their house, Louisa, it is found that Mr. Bounderbye's breakfast is not yet prepared because Louisa has not yet come downstairs, and she simply, tries to pretend as if she supports her. And in fact, when Mr. Bounderbye says that Louisa is actually very reluctant, she's very unwilling to fulfill her, to carry out her duties as a wife, instead of, supporting Mr. Bounderbye on the outside, what Mrs. Parseet does, she simply, disapproves of his behavior and says that he's being unkind to her. Here, when Louisa comes downstairs, several remarks are passed by Mr. Bounderbye, but those are not taken into consideration. They are not paid much attention by Louisa, but still we can find that the atmosphere in the household is quite tense, and that a little quarrel takes place between Bounderbye and Louisa Gradgrind, which also reflects the discontentment, or which also reflects the dissatisfaction that is there in this marriage, because we know that the marriage that took place between Bounderbye and Louisa Gradgrind is a loveless one. So it is quite natural for Louisa Gradgrind not to have affection, love for a man like Mr. Bounderbye, because Mr. Bounderbye, instead of treating her as his wife, we find that he continues to look upon her as a child, and that influences his attitude, that influences his treatment towards her as well. So after the breakfast gets over, Bidzar, arrives, and he informs Louisa about Mrs. Gradgrind's sickness. And after this, we find that Louisa Gradgrind, while she's on her way to her father's home in Cooktown, she ponders her childhood, and she also reflects, on the emotional distance that she had with her family and with her mother, with everybody, because she has never been, we have seen that Louisa Gradgrind has never been able, to express herself to her family members, excepting her brother Tom. So while she is on her way to her father's home in Cooktown, she reflects on this, on her childhood life and her relationship with her family And another important aspect in this chapter is find that Mrs. Parseet, though on the outside she is very respectful to Bounderby, but in his absence she expresses her resentment, she expresses her dissatisfaction. Her real feelings come to the surface when she outbursts, looking at Mr. Bounderby's portrait, addressing him as Noodle. Noodle is actually a term that is used to insult someone's intelligence when we consider someone to be shallow, not having much intellect. Then we refer to that person as Noodle. And this is the term that is used by Mrs. Parseet when he addresses Bounderby when he is not there. So her frustration is completely revealed in her outburst toward the portrait, because according to her, Mr. Bounderby lacks foresight. He lacks comprehension, and that is why he has married a girl like Louisa Gradgrind, who is not even interested in carrying out her domestic duties or in preparing her husband's breakfast. So according to Mrs. Parseet, Mr. Bounderby lacks comprehension and foresight. And that is why he sent her away. He sent Mrs. Parseet away from her comfortable position. Because while she was, here in Mr. Bounderby's country house, she led a very comfortable life. She led a very complacent life. And it is only after his marriage with Louisa Gradgrind that she loses her this comfortable position in this house. And she holds this marriage to be, she holds this marriage between Bounderby and Louisa responsible for her present plight. Not only that, in this chapter we also get to see Mrs. Gradgrind, though throughout the novel she appears to be a non-entity. We only find her echoing her husband's words, but it is only on her deathbed and when Louisa comes to see her on her deathbed that we see her eloquence and her understanding. Not only that, we find that she expresses, her extraordinary perception of Mr. Gradgrind as well as their daughter Louisa Gradgrind. And for the first time, we find that she expresses that Mr. Gradgrind's education had something inappropriate. In fact, it lacked something which failed to lend a proper grooming to their children. So here for the first time, this is through her eloquence and her understanding, Mrs. Gradgrind expresses her doubts regarding Mr. Gradgrind's education that he had imparted to his children. So while being on her deathbed, Mrs. Gradgrind observes that something was missing in his teaching philosophy, but she is unable to express what it is. But then she says that though she is unable to name them, that what that lack is in Mr. Gradgrind's education, but one thing she knows, she confirms that those unnameable parts are vital, are important to survival as any fact. Just as we cannot refute facts, so we cannot refute those parts which she is unable to name. So from this perspective, we can see that even when she is on her deathbed, she is able to understand that lack in Mr. Gradgrind's education, and while talking about pain, she is also able to comprehend the pain that her daughter Louisa is going through, and she is also able to understand the vacuum, the emptiness that Louisa is suffering from, that her marriage is suffering from, and that she is also unable to connect to other people, that she is unable to, express herself to other people. All these are realized by Mrs. Gradgrind on her deathbed. And after, then she actually asks for a pen to write something, but then she imagines she's unable, she's in such a state that she's unable to hold a pen. But then after that we find that her hand stops and she breathes her last. We also find in chapter 9 that when we come to the end of this chapter, we find that Mrs. Gradgrind's speech proves that Mr. Gradgrind's education has been a total failure, because it is very much evident the way Tom has turned up to be, the kind of man he has become. And not only that, Louisa's unhappy marriage and her entanglement, her relationship, growing intimacy with Harthouse, all these are evident that Mr. Gradgrind's education has not been fruitful. And Mrs. Gradgrind, while lying on her deathbed, evinces the truth. She simply proves it. And not only that, she evinces the truth-telling traditionally associated with the dying, because in most of the cases we find, that when someone is on deathbed, is able to express the truth while someone is about to breathe his or her last, and that is, this truth telling is traditionally associated with the dying in this chapter. Not only that, the quarrel that takes place in the breakfast table between Bounderby and Louisa also highlights her alienation from her husband, and that she is gradually getting inclined towards James Harthouse. It is also one of the reasons because Mr. Bounderby is not able to empathize with her. And not only that, the quarrel that takes place at the breakfast table, we find that how their relationship is becoming more and more, openly hostile, as if they are not husband-wife, but they are, they behave like enemies. And as far as Mrs. Parsit is concerned, we know that she admires Harthouse for his social status, and he looks good for his appearance as well, and that she refuses to acknowledge Louisa as Mrs. Bounderby shows her denial to accept their marriage, that she has never accepted Mr. Bounderby's marriage with Louisa Gradgrind. And in this chapter, we also find that how tactfully she actually plays foul. How she tries to play, make Bounderby go against Louisa Gradgrind. That is also seen in her behavior. And from the next chapter onwards, we shall see how she, plays the role of a spy and schemes and plots against Louisa Gradgrind. Chapter 10 is titled as Mrs. Parsit's Staircase. Now the title of this chapter is very significant because this is the staircase that Louisa, is supposed to descend metaphorically. It is this image of the staircase. Because now we find that Mrs. Parsit is all determined, to see Louisa's downfall, Louisa's social decline, and she expects her to get involved with James Harthouse. She wants her to get involved with James Harthouse so that it can bring about her ruin and disaster. And this image of the staircase, which I said that Louisa is metaphorically descending. How is she descending the staircase? How she is coming down this staircase actually refers to social staircase. Okay, a social staircase which which is associated with one's social reputation. And Mrs. Parsit wants Louisa to descend, to come down this staircase as much as possible, because on one hand she wants Mr. Bounderby to get what he deserves. Why? Because she has never accepted this marriage, and by marrying Louisa Gradgrind, he has simply, removed Mrs. Parsit from her comfortable position as his housekeeper. So now, on one hand, he wants Mr. Bounderby to get what he deserves, and on the other hand, he also wants Louisa to come down this, to suffer, social shame. And this idea will be repeated in the titles of the next two chapters, which are Lower and Lower and Down, which means Louisa is gradually descending. She is gradually getting declined socially. So what we find in this chapter, that now Mrs. Parsit dreams of Louisa's downfall, her social shaming, her social decline. As far as Mr. Bounderby is concerned, he doesn't have any problem with Mrs. Parsit staying at their place, and Mrs. Parsit now keeps a watch on Louisa and her interaction with Mr. Harthouse. So she feels, because Mrs. Parsit's, resentment, her dislike towards Louisa gradually gets transformed into malice, because now she dreams of her downfall, and she believes that it is her extramarital relationship or this growing intimacy with Harthouse which would help in bringing about, which would be quite instrumental in bringing about Louisa's downfall. So now she's all set to observe both of them together, their activities as well. We know that she is angry with Louisa for disrupting her, social status as Mr. Bounderby's housekeeper, but it is quite possible that she may have, or it is quite possible that she may have got a romantic interest in Bounderby, but that is not depicted explicitly in the novel. So now, if you look at this chapter, we find that Mr. Harthouse and Louisa, they are sitting in the garden side by side, and they are observed by Mrs. Parsit. But then this chapter basically revolves around two main interests. One is, we find that Louisa's liaison with Harthouse, her intimacy with Harthouse, her extramarital relationship with Harthouse, it is in progress. We see the progress in this in this growing intimacy, and then the mystery is still there as to who robbed the bank. So these are the two main interests around which this chapter revolves. Now, if you look at the image of the staircase, then what is hinted at by this image of staircase is that we know that Mrs. Parsit expects, or she is determined to see Louisa's social decline. And how is this social decline possible? It would be possible only when, or only if, she elopes with James Harthouse. So this image of staircase makes it inevitable, because in the upcoming chapters they are titled as Lower and Lower and Down, which means that Louisa would descend more and more. So this staircase actually hints at the inevitable elopement that is going to take place between Louisa and Harthouse, and this adulterous relationship, that Louisa's inevitable involvement with James Harthouse and their consequent, or the subsequent, let's say, and their elopement. Here, another important aspect that is highlighted in this chapter is while Louisa is conversing with James Harthouse, she expresses her suspicion that her brother might be involved in the robbery of the bank. Though her doubt or her suspicion is not too high, it's on a low level, yet she talks to James Harthouse about his suspicions of Stephen Blackpool as well. And then she's actually, surprised to see that Louisa sympathizes with Stephen. She has that sympathetic feeling for Stephen because somewhere she feels that Stephen is not, Stephen has, is not responsible for this crime. And which shows her, a true reading of his character, that it is quite possible that he may not be, involved in this crime. But that is contrasted with Harthouse's negligent cynicism, because when he is asked like whether he suspects Stephen or not, then he says that yes, it is quite possible that he did it. But then this statement made by Harthouse makes this very statement made by Harthouse makes Louisa, stop suspecting her own brother Tom, because she finds that according to Harthouse, it is quite possible, and there is a strong that even Stephen has a strong motive. So it is quite possible that he had committed the crime. So we see how Louisa's sympathetic, understanding character is contrasted with Harthouse's negligent cynicism, because he's unable to see. Why cynicism? Because he's unable to see anything good in Stephen Blackpool's character. Chapter 11 is titled as Lower and Lower, and the title is significant in relation to Louisa's relationship with James Harthouse. In this chapter, we find that Mrs. Parseet, she's not satisfied only to think about Louisa's social downfall, social decline, but now she's seen playing a very active role in bringing about her downfall. And here, in this chapter, we find that Mr. Bounderby is going on a business trip, and that's why he asks Mrs. Parseet to stay with Louisa on this weekend. But after Mr. Bounderby leaves, what Mrs. Parseet does, she informs Louisa that on account of her sickness, she won't be able to come to the country house for the weekend. And then later, she behaves very well with Tom in order to fetch information regarding Harthouse, and she comes to know that Tom has been asked to wait at the station by James Harthouse. And after she learns this, that Harthouse is about to return from a trip, that evening she becomes determined, and therefore she begins to spy. She begins to follow Harthouse and Louisa and their activities again. So on Friday, Mr. Bounderby, he goes on his business trip, and on Saturday, Mrs. Parseet goes to the station, and there she watches Tom waiting for Harthouse's arrival. But then Harthouse is not seen there. There is no trace of Harthouse in the there is no trace of Harthouse at the station. And then immediately Mrs. Parseet understands that Tom has been tricked by Harthouse, and that Tom has been tricked by Harthouse so that he could meet Louisa all alone at Bounderby's place. And this very incident makes Mrs. Parseet spy on him and Louisa in the garden. And she immediately rushes to the country house, and where she finds them talking to each other in the garden, where she finds, now she hides herself in the bushes, and from there she observes Louisa and Harthouse meeting in the garden. And in this chapter, we find that Harthouse expresses his love for Louisa, though Louisa asks him to leave her alone, but then Harthouse tries to persuade her, saying that if they cannot have, if they cannot have, we cannot be together, or if they cannot have a relation here, or if it is not possible for them to meet here, then they could go somewhere else and meet, and then it is decided between them that they'll be meeting again that night. And after some time, we find Harthouse leaving on his horse, and after some time, after a short while, even Louisa leaves for the train station, which again makes Mrs. Parsit follow her. So here, Mrs. Parsit is portrayed as a comic detective, because the scene, in the bushes in the garden where she gets completely drenched in rain with mud all over her body, she appears to be like she is portrayed as a comic detective. And she is not only motivated by jealousy, but it is her anger, her resentment, or let's say even from her activity we can say that she has a revengeful attitude as well, okay, which motivates her to act or to play the role of a spy and a plotter. So Harthouse tricked Tom in order to meet Louisa all alone, to keep him away from Louisa, and Mrs. Parsit also has devised her own plot in order to bring about Louisa's social decline. And now we find Mrs. Parsit, she follows Louisa to Cooktown. She also gets into the train, but when the train reaches the station and destination, she loses her. She loses her sight. So it is quite possible that in the crowd outside the station, Mrs. Parsit lost her sight of Louisa, or it could be that Louisa's sudden disappearance from the station is the result of her eluding Mrs. Parsit, either wittingly or unwittingly. It may be that Louisa also, saw Mrs. Parsit, and so in order to avoid her, she wittingly disappeared from the station, so that she is unable to follow her. So from here we can understand, we seem to feel that Louisa disappeared all of a sudden in order to meet Harthouse. It is quite possible because the incidents that are taking place in the novel, in this very chapter, do hint at that Louisa went to Cooktown because that would be the safest place for her to meet Harthouse. And here in this chapter, when Harthouse expresses his love for Louisa, the way he delivers his speech in a very convincing way, it shows his attempt to seduce a married woman. But this attempt on the part of Harthouse shows that it will definitely bring about Louisa's disreputation. It will definitely bring about her social decline if she responds to Harthouse's proposal. And at the same time, this act on the part of Harthouse points to a lack of concern for her well-being, because I kept on saying the same thing, and I would again say the same. I would again repeat that Harthouse is not at all concerned about anyone's reputation or disreputation. He is only concerned about his own amusement. So here, despite knowing that she is a married woman, and his relationship with her could disrepute her in society, but he is not concerned, and that shows his lack of concern. A contrast is very well depicted in this chapter by Dickens. The relationship between Stephen Blackpool and Rachel is very poor. They are representatives of the working class people, and as far as social reputation is concerned, social status is concerned, that the one which they have that is less valuable than the one that Louisa has as a representative of the upper class. Stephen Blackpool is aware of Rachel's honor and reputation within their community, and that is why he decides only to love her from afar, from a distance, not to cause any damage to her social reputation, because he knows that he is unable to get out of his marriage. He is unable to marry her, so he does not want Rachel's social reputation to get affected in any way. While, if you look at the character of Harthouse, he does not have that same integrity, that truthfulness, that honesty that Stephen Blackpool shows in his in his treatment of Rachel. Harthouse undoubtedly considers himself superior to Blackpool, but as far as morality is concerned, he is quite inferior to Stephen, because he fails to show that respect, he fails to show that concern for an individual, and at the same time he fails to show that honesty, that truthfulness that Stephen Blackpool has, despite all the. So what Dickens is trying to highlight here, that though they are representatives of the working class, though they belong to the working class, and they are always looked down upon by others, by the wealthier class, but when it comes to morality, they do have morals of their own, they abide some principles in their life, but when it comes to this wealthier class, this upper class, they do not seem to have morality at all. Chapter 12 is titled as Down. This is the final chapter of Book 2. This title is significant and ironical at the same time. If we try to compare this title to the titles of the last two chapters, like Mrs. Sparseat's Staircase and Lower and Lower, then we shall see that those two chapters seem to indicate that Louisa would suffer from a social decline. She would get involved, she would elope with Harthouse and end her marriage with Bounderby. But when we read this chapter, we get to see something different. As I said, the title is ironical. Here, the title Down does not imply that Louisa has descended the social staircase and brought about shame on herself as well as her family. It does not imply that. Rather, it shows how a daughter comes down on her knees before her father, seeking his help to save her from her miserable state, and how she collapses and comes down at her father's feet. So this chapter is emotional as well, is very emotional at the same time, because we do know Louisa does not meet James Harthouse after their meeting in the garden where he declared his love for her. Instead, she visits her father's house and discloses everything that has brought her in this situation. She discloses how dissatisfied she is with her marriage, how dissatisfied she is with Mr. Bounderby, that she does not have any love, any affection for Mr. Bounderby, and she also admits that she has developed a relationship with a man who she believes understands her. And she also informs Mr. Gradgrind that she will be meeting him that very night and then elope from her house. That's what they had decided upon. This is what she informs Gradgrind. But then, instead of doing that, she has come to her father for help. We know that Louisa has always been unable to express her emotions. She has always been very indifferent to her own feelings. She has been quite a passive character. And even in this very situation, she does not know if she really loves Hothouse or not. And she also admits that she has not even, got physically intimate with Hothouse. And then she simply begs her father to help her, to save her from this situation, and comes down at his feet. So herein lies the significance of the title of this chapter, Down. So the way Louisa breaks down at her father's house, it shows this turning point for both the father and the daughter. Louisa is able to understand that her education of facts has not, enabled her to encounter the outside world, to deal with the outside world. It has failed to groom her that way. And Mr. Gradgrind realizes that his education has been a total failure. Instead of giving them a beautiful life, a happy, peaceful life, his education of facts has actually damaged both of them, both Tom and Louisa, because now he knows the truth. So this is Louisa's miserable condition that disillusions Mr. Gradgrind regarding his fact-based education. Now he understands that how fruitless it has been. And this Louisa's unhappy state, even in this unhappy state, one thing is to be noted, that Louisa is, she's still able to retain her right behavior. She still possesses that sense of right behavior. And this is the climax of Louisa's role in the novel. Although Hothouse tries his best to persuade Louisa Gradgrind to elope with him or to get into an extramarital relationship with him, but he fails. And this comes as a major disappointment for him, a humiliating disappointment for him. And at the same time, when this entire episode with James Hothouse is disclosed to Mr. Gradgrind, he realizes the complete failure of his system of education or his teaching philosophy. So this scene forms a parallel or complement to that which occurred near the end of the first book, in chapter 15, where we found that a conversation took place between Gradgrind and Louisa, where Louisa was asked to keep aside all sentimentality, all her emotions, and think logically and think with pure reason and get married to Bounderby. And here, where in that chapter we found Mr. Gradgrind completely emphasizing on the factual approach to life, logical approach to life, while in this chapter we find Gradgrind getting completely disillusioned. So it forms a parallel, as I said. It's kind of, that chapter it's kind of complements this one as well. Because in that chapter, we found that even Louisa, even though she had no affection, she had no liking for Bounderby, she agreed to marry him without any enthusiasm because she was unable to express her emotions. But now in this chapter, we find her expressing herself full-fledgedly before her father, making him realize how unhappy she is in her married life, and how she was close, how she was about to get involved in a shameful extramarital affair. So this chapter is significant because this realization dawns upon both father and daughter. Now Gradgrind realizes the fruitlessness of his teaching philosophy, the failure of his factual education, and at the same time Louisa is able to understand that her fact-based education had failed to prepare her for the world, or it actually did not provide her with enough knowledge to prepare herself to encounter the outside world, deal with crisis. So Louisa's, it is also expressed that how Louisa's, loveless marriage has made her completely emotionally numb. Because we know that Louisa married Bounderby only for the cause of her father, because she wanted her father to be happy, and so she simply performed her role as a performed her duty rather as a daughter. And another reason was that she wanted to ensure her brother's job at the bank. She wanted to help her brother. And now Louisa's situation is such that she has become emotionally numb. And she was almost, getting into this extramarital affair with Harthouse. But as I said, that even in this crisis, she is able to retain the sense of right and wrong. She is able to retain her rightful behavior, which finally made her take herself away from Harthouse and surrender completely before her father, Mr. Gradgrind. And it is also very ironical that when Louisa asks Mr. Gradgrind to help her, to rescue her, to save her from her miserable plight, she is unable to realize, she is unable to understand that it is not only she who needs help, who needs to be saved, but even her father, Mr. Gradgrind, equally needs to be saved. Why? Because the way his teaching philosophy based on facts has damaged both Tom and Louisa, it has also damaged him as well. Because now he can no longer boast of being a responsible father. He can no longer boast that he has, very successfully brought up his children. Because Louisa, who he admired so much, who he was so much fond of, is now lying on her knees before him in a completely miserable state. And at this point, this very incident becomes a turning point for both Mr. Gradgrind and Louisa Gradgrind. And with this, chapter 12 comes to an end.